So now we'll get into the discussion for this week. We're going back into our cycle of readings. Last week was Shavuot, so we had some special readings for that particular occasion. But now we've gotten back into the book of Numbers. So this week's portion is Nasso, referring to the census that was taken, and I've called this the section on the Nazarite. So this is the section in the Torah which talks about the Nazarite vow. I have given a talk about this before, but I've sort of looked over it and tried to improve this talk compared to the last version. So there will be new material in here, just sort of reflecting different things that I've learned since I gave the last talk. So I hope it's interesting for those of you who have heard the previous talk. The references for this week's portion, you can see up there. It's quite a large portion, actually. We've got essentially 4 big chapters in the book of Numbers. And we've also got the book of Judges and chapter 13, and also the book of Luke as well, which is the gospel section. So there's a bit of an, I guess, outline of the flow of the talk today. So I'll be going through 5 main sections. So I'll be recapping our current context, as we always try to do as we go through the Torah readings. I'll actually be reading the pertinent scriptures regarding the commandments of the Nazarites. Well, not really commandments, but the section on the Nazarite, and also just summarizing the relevant details. Discussion regarding the role of pleasure and pain in scriptures. There are actually discussions about this in scripture. Also just touching on Yeshua's teaching on fasting and Paul and so his relationship with the Nazarite vow as well. So definitely trying to go through a chronology almost in our understanding of Nazarite from the Torah context right through to the New Testament. So in terms of the current context, we've got, obviously, we're close to the book of Numbers. We've started Midbar, which was the first portion. Also, it's the name of the Hebrew name for the whole book. It means in the desert. So we're pretty much still at the beginning of the book of Numbers. The last portion of Midbar contained a large census, which counted all of Israel's fighting men. That was something that God initiated. Another census also takes place this week. And this refers to the counting of the sons of Gershon and Merari. And we also have a counting of the Levites. And we're told that at the time, there were 8,580 Levites. So obviously quite specific census. So we found it out this week as well. There were 2 other also important events discussed this week. So one of them is actually a very interesting story. The story of the Sotar, the ritual of the Sotar. So what that was is essentially when it seems a bit sort of, unusual compared to sort of modern ethics, but essentially if a man suspected his wife was committing adultery, but he had no proof, so that the Torah calls this jealousy. So he was jealous over his wife, and what that really meant was, he thought that his wife was cheating on him, but he wasn't sure. He couldn't prove it. So, but he had those feelings. So essentially a man could participate in a certain ritual and the woman in question was also compelled to participate, and that in that way the guilt of the woman or innocence would be established. Essentially relied on the miracle of drinking the water. If the woman was guilty, there would be a sort of divine miracle to essentially make the water kill her. But if she was innocent, then she'd be fine. So that's a very interesting discussion on its own. But that's not the discussion of today's talk. I'll be discussing the issues relating to the Nazarite. So to learn what the Nazarite vow actually was, let's read the book of Numbers, chapter 6, the first 8 verses. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazarite, to separate himself to the Lord, he shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice of grapes or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All the days of his separation he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. All the days of his vow of separation no razor shall touch his head, until the time is completed for which he separates himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. He shall let the locks of hair of his head grow long. All the days that he separates himself to the Lord he shall not go near a dead body, not even for his father or for his mother, for brother or sister. If they die, he shall make himself unclean, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation he is holy to the Lord." So this is a quick summary of all that. So very important, either a man or woman could do this, and it was a voluntary vow. So it wasn't a commandment per se. It was something that if if a man or woman wanted to make a special sort of dedication to God, they were given this avenue to do so. So it was a voluntary vow. So in terms of prohibitions, so essentially the idea was to avoid fermented products, fermented drink in particular, so wine and other alcohol, vinegar, but also had to avoid grapes as well, as probably as a precaution. You couldn't cut your hair, so it had to remain long and messy. Couldn't come into contact with a dead person, even close family members as well. So if someone in your immediate circle died, too bad, you had to either end your vow or you couldn't go to the funeral, essentially. And if the person wanted to complete the vow or was forced to stop it after being in contact with the dead or wine, for example, then he needed to shave his head and offer a sacrifice. They're the sort of relevant details of the mechanics of the vow. There is actually a very interesting discussion in Jewish literature, in the Talmudic literature, regarding pleasure. So, of course, as part of the vow, you had to avoid alcohol, you had to keep your hair long. So, of course, keeping yourself clean and drinking are seen as pleasures of this life. And the sages actually looked negatively upon those who voluntarily took this vow. So, interesting, because it was something that was written in the Torah as something that God gave, but the sages actually looked negatively upon those who took the vow, calling them actually sinners. And that's there's a wider discussion in Shacharit Nazarite 10a, if you were interested in in reading that further. Literally all you have to do is Google, you can either go through Sefaria.org, which Sefaria.org is essentially sort of mostly free database of Jewish texts online, and if you search the Talmud there, if you type that in, you actually can find the discussion. It's quite interesting, the rationales that they gave. Excuse me. And also, the reason for this, in summary, was that the sages thought that voluntarily withdrawing from pleasure was seen as an evil, even if it was for a noble purpose, for trying to draw close to God. They were still seen as something that shouldn't happen. And this is despite the plain text actually saying that God gave this method of drawing close to himself as a way to draw close to himself actually in the scripture itself. So it's interesting why the sages would say that. But I do think there is a little bit of theology that we can look at in regards to this. The scriptures themselves give a nuanced picture. So like most things, it's not to one extreme or the other. I do think there's nuance in lots of different issues, but in particular this issue. So there are many verses in the scriptures which talk about pleasure as being important and good. So the sages were right in saying that pleasure in the Bible is seen as a good thing, so it's not something to be avoided. So they did have a point when it comes to that. And I'll just give just two examples. One example from the Tanakh in Proverbs 17, verse 22. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. Pretty self-explanatory there. And John chapter 10, verse 10. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. So Yeshua talking, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So when Yeshua is talking about having life abundantly, he's actually referring to enjoying life to the fullest as well. So again, there is good scriptural evidence to say that pleasure is good. But I do think, if I may respectfully disagree with the sages in their sort of rather extreme denunciation of such a vow, we're also warned against excess as well. And there are also many different scriptures which do this. For the sake of brevity, I'll just quote two. Also from Proverbs 22, verse 17, whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich. So essentially, again, practical advice, warning someone, if you chase pleasure, you're going to end up worse, in a worse situation. And in the book of Luke 8, verse 14, as for those who fell among the thorns, they are those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of life, and their fruit does not mature. So in this context, again, the parable of Yeshua talking about where the seed fell, and this particular part of the parable was the seed falling among thorns, and to him, these presented the disciples, the people who heard, but were sort of influenced by the pleasures and cares of the life, and therefore their witness and their faith was sort of muted in a sense, and did not mature to produce fruit. So again, there is a nuanced picture in the scripture. The overall picture, I would say, is definitely nuanced. Pleasure is good, and God created it for our benefit. but we must not chase it. So we're not hedonists. The scripture is not a hedonistic ideology. It's so in particular the ancient Greeks were well known for chasing pleasure as sort of the meaning of life. Scripture is definitely not that. We are not, even though pleasure is good, it is not the meaning of life. So that's essentially when you take the nuanced picture, that's the conclusion I think Scripture is trying to point us towards. Sin itself can actually manifest as pleasurable things, and there are times when abstaining from pleasure is necessary to do the will of God. Life is to be enjoyed, but not at the expense of high purposes. That's essentially boiling this idea down to a single sentence. Now, I wanted to add some different perspectives on the teaching regarding pleasure, one from Yeshua and one from Paul. So, as people would agree, eating is one of life's great pleasures. Who doesn't like to eat the foods they like? And Yeshua had a bit to say about fasting. So let's read, which of course abstaining from the pleasure of eating food. So let's read from Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 to 18. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others that they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Of course, the main thrust of this discussion is Jesus warning against hypocritical fasting. Actually, it's funny, interesting, like it actually makes it. It's funny to me actually. People like making their faces like really miserable, like I'm suffering. Actually, and I think I've done that once or twice. So definitely something that I need to improve upon as well. But essentially, it's warning. If you're abstaining from something, don't make it obvious. If you want others to sort of respect you for doing this, that's going to be your reward. You will get the respect, but you're not going to get any special reward from God. But if you do it in a discreet, humble way, then God will indeed reward you. So he warns about hypocritical fasting. However, there's also more to what he's saying here as well. So he implies that fasting does have its own reward, because he says that God rewards those who fast. And he uses the word when, not if. So he actually is expecting people to fast. He's not actually asking, if you're going to fast, then do these things. He's actually saying, when you fast, this is how you should do it. So he actually assumes that people will fast. The benefits of fasting intermittently are actually corroborated by the rest of Scripture as a powerful tool to draw close to God. And we can read, again, there's so many different examples. I'll quote a couple. And I think the clearest one is from actually the book of Joel. Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. And again, quite clearly from the plain text, returning to God in his context involved fasting. So very, very clear teaching there. And also from the book of Luke, chapter 2, verses 36 to 37. And very interesting discussion here of this old prophetess. There was a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. So a bit more complexity to this discussion here, but Anna was a woman who was obviously old. She experienced life. She suffered through life. Unfortunately, she didn't have a husband for very long. And in this sort of context, she's actually praised for this. Like it's something to be respected. The reader is meant to respect Anna for her example in this situation, and in this situation, she's not directly praised, but the tone of the conversation is meant to lead with respect for the person. So she's never left the temple, so she prayed a lot, and as part of that, she was fasting again. So the reader is led to have respect for Anna's practices, including fasting as well. So fasting is seen as beneficial in Scripture as a whole. However, even this teaching is nuanced. So I want to actually talk about what Paul said about another pleasure, sex, to give the nuance to the discussion. So he comments in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5, do not deprive each other. So again, this is husband and wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So again, he implies that abstaining from a pleasure, in this case sexual relations, for a short fixed time can be helpful, but we're not made to be permanently abstinent from pleasures. And actually being permanent, he actually says here quite clearly, if you try to perpetuate this abstinence, you can actually lead yourself to sin. And he says here, because you don't have self-control. If you try and do this forever, you're going to go down the wrong path. So enjoy your pleasure, essentially. Now, I don't want to, again, bash Catholics here, because that's not what I'm trying to do. I never try to do this through the talks I give. But in regards to some of the abstinences that, the vows of abstinence that Catholic clergy have to take, I think with this teaching in mind, I think, again, perhaps people have the right idea. I think they're obviously trying to dedicate themselves to God, and they're trying to serve God only and not themselves. And again, they have the right idea. But I think the reason Paul's teaching is so pertinent, it actually takes into account the realities of the human condition. I think if we try and go through life, thinking that abstaining from our pleasure will actually lead to holiness in the church, I think actually it's going to lead to the opposite. And unfortunately, throughout too many times in history, that's what's happened. Not only in the Catholic Church, but in other churches too, where oaths of abstinence have been taken, and it's just led to sin manifesting in different, actually probably worse ways than would have otherwise happened. So I do think even history of the church has can teach us that fixed short times to abstain from pleasure can be helpful, but if we try and make it a perpetual thing, it can lead to a lot of problems. And in that way, I think the teaching of the sages actually makes a lot of sense. If someone tries to just abstain from pleasure for the hell of it, it's not going to lead to more problems. Sorry, hang on, I went the wrong way. Just want to quickly finish with a discussion about Paul and the Nazarite here. So there's an interesting conversation in the book of Acts where Paul visits James, and James tells him that there are Jewish believers who are zealous for the law. So in other words, who are sort of keepers of the Torah. And they had heard rumors that Paul undermines the Torah. So James, as a result, advises Paul to do something, and this is what happens in towards the end of Acts 21. Do therefore what we tell you. We are 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in accordance of the law. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So again, this is an ESV translation. Again, a bit of context is important. So Paul himself isn't actually making a Nazarite vow. So that's important. A lot of people think, therefore, he was a Nazarite himself. That's not true. That's not what the scriptures say here. Perhaps there's other scriptures which may imply this, but in this particular context, he's not himself making a Nazarite vow, and there's no implication that he actually is coming out himself. What he is doing is he's helping these 4 men who are Nazarites. So, the reason we know they're Nazarites is actually quite easy, because there are no other vows which are given in the Torah which end specifically with the shaving of the head. Well, I can't think of one at the moment. If there are ones that I've missed, please comment on the YouTube entry for this. But as far as we know, there are no other scripturally commanded or scripturally sanctioned vows which ended specifically by the shaving of heads. Only the Nazarite vow did. So that's way we can actually know quite easily that these 4 men were Nazarites. Now, Paul was advised to do this to show solidarity with the sort of Torah observant Jewish believers. It was more of if you look at sort of these days, we have people who do, who walk with the protesters, who visits, minorities and things like that. So it's more like it's a political tool. Now, again, I think it was a political tool with the right purpose, but in this sort of context, there was sort of a bit of tension, and it's actually eerily reminiscent of some of the current tensions. Say there's in the population of believers, there were people who were agitated, perhaps, that hey, this disciple, this apostle to the Gentiles, he's undermining the Torah that we're observing. What's going on here? He's supposed to be one of our leaders. So as a result, then James advises Paul not to do this in a disingenuous way, but to show solidarity with them and actually show that actually no, I do identify with you, and I myself actually take the Torah seriously. In that regard, I'm going to help these Nazarites fulfill their vow, because that is a vow that's given, that's voluntary in the Torah. So if I'm helping these men do something that is voluntary in the Torah, then how much more so I'd be supportive of the rest of it. So in this sort of sense, it's actually very clever political tool that James and Paul sort of come up with here. And in the modern day, politics has a negative connotation. I don't think that's necessarily the case in Scripture. Politics can be positive or negative depending on the situation. The context is not implied just because it's political. I think we're too extreme when it comes to our politics. Really, I think really we need to look at the merits of different points of view and not get to hasty conclusions all the time. Beyond the Torah itself, though, it also shows that these sort of vows to abstain from pleasure for a short time has a place in the life of the believer. So, as Timothy says himself, all of Scripture is there to instruct us, and I don't think he's actually saying here, therefore, that believers should become Nazirites. I think what he's saying here is that the example of the Nazarite, which is that abstaining from pleasures for a short time can be beneficial to draw one closer to God, has a place in the life of a believer. It is something that can be of benefit to a believer, and that idea can manifest itself in many different ways, but it is an important idea. So I do think it has an application beyond the scope of Torah itself. We'll stop there for the moment. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion today. I hope it's also been relevant to your walk as a believer. I think sometimes with discussions about the Torah, there's a tendency to leave it in the past, just more of an intellectual discussion, but I hope that this has been helpful to everyone.